To my video on integers and absolute value. So you will be able to identify and describe the absolute value for rational numbers. But before we get into absolute value, we need to review what an integer is. So what is an integer? An integer is a whole number that can be graphed on a number line. Integers less than 0 are negative. And integers greater than 0 are positive. And then 0 is neither negative nor positive. So all whole numbers and their opposites are considered integers. So in other words, it doesn't have a decimal. They're negative and positive whole numbers. So an example would be 7 and its opposite, negative 7, are both integers. So let's go ahead and move on here to some real life examples of integers. 50 degrees below 0. That would be negative because it's below 0, so negative 50. You owe your parents $10, so you are in the negative since you owe them money, so that's negative 10. And a deposit of $50 would be a positive because your account is going up. Okay, now let's look at absolute value. Absolute value is how far a number is from 0. And the absolute value of 0 always equals 0. Okay, now let's look at some examples here. So let me scoot this up. And it says the absolute value of 6 is 6. And the absolute value of negative 6 is also 6. So this symbol right here is considered absolute value. And that's because 6 is 6 units from 0. And negative 6 is also 6 units from 0. So the absolute value of 6 is 6. And the absolute value of negative 6 is also 6 because they're both 6 places away from 0. And you can see that right here on the number line. So just another quick review here. Absolute value is the distance from 0. And absolute value will always be positive because distance is always positive. Okay, make sure you have everything written down and go ahead and turn the page. And here are some more examples of absolute value, and it says explain why, but we're going to explain it verbally so you don't have to write that down. So the first one, this symbol is absolute value, so it says the absolute value of negative 1/2, which would be 1/2 because it's a half a space away from 0. The second example here is the absolute value of 100, so that would be 100 because it's 100 places away from 0. And one of the biggest misconceptions of absolute value is people think it means opposite. It does not mean opposite. It means the distance from 0. Now look at this last one. This last one's a little bit tricky. So the absolute value of 12.5 is 12.5. However, that is not the answer to this one because if you look right here, there's a negative. So when there's a negative outside of the absolute value, that will make it the value negative. So I know we said the absolute value of a number is always positive, and that was true. But what made it negative is because there was a negative outside of the absolute value symbol, which means we have to multiply it by -1. So that's why our final answer here is actually negative 12.5. Okay, so that one's a little bit tricky. Write an integer to represent the situation just like we did on the front page. So a gain of 5 yards would be positive 5. 50 degrees below 0 would be negative 50. A withdrawal of $60 would be negative 60 because you're taking $60 out of your account. A deposit of $75 would be positive 75 because your account is going up. 2,152 feet above sea level would be positive 2,152. because you're above sea level, and a fish swims 15 feet below water, that would be negative 15. So now let's look at the next section. So I'm going to go ahead and make this disappear, and we're going to look at evaluate. Okay, so in this evaluate, there's 6 problems here, and all these symbols are absolute value. So the first one says the absolute value of 11. So how far is 11 away from 0? It is 11. Remember, it's not opposite, it's how far it is away from 0. The second one, absolute value of negative 33. How far is it away from 0? It's 33 spaces. Negative 20, the absolute value of negative 20 is positive 20 because it's 20 spaces away from 0. The absolute value of negative 21 is positive 21 because it's 21 spaces away from 0. Absolute value of 13 is 13 because it's 13 spaces away from 0. And finally, the absolute value of 15 is 15 because it's 15 spaces away from 0. So notice all these answers were positive because distance is always positive, and there wasn't a negative outside of the absolute value symbol like there was in one of the previous examples above. So let's look at a couple more problems. We have a comparing section here that says use less than, less than, greater than, or equal to. Okay, so what we have to do here is we actually have to find the absolute value first before we can compare these. So the absolute value of negative 12 is 12 because it's 12 spaces away from 0. And the absolute value of 10 is 10 because it's 10 spaces away from 0. Now I have to compare 12 to 10, and I know 12 is greater than 10, so put a greater than symbol. The absolute value of 15 is 15. And the absolute value of negative 15 is also 15. So now I see that both of these are equal because they're both 15 places away from 0. So if I ever ask you a question, find 2 numbers that have the same absolute value, you could find a number and its opposite, and they would have the same absolute value because they're both the same amount of spaces away from 0. The next example, absolute value of 3 is 3, and the absolute value of negative 7 is positive 7. So how does 3 compare to 7? It is less than. So over here, it says circle all values that are true. So I'm going to find the absolute value and see if it's actually true. So the absolute value of 55 is positive 55, so this is not true. Now here, I just flip-flopped this, so right here, the absolute value of negative 63 is positive 63, so that is true, so let's circle. The absolute value of 3/4 is positive 3/4, so I'm going to eliminate this one. The absolute value of negative 10 is positive 10, so I'm going to eliminate that one. The absolute value of 2.6 is positive 2.6, so I am going to circle that one. And finally, the absolute value of negative 4/5 is positive 4/5, so I would circle this one. So in this blurb here, it says, remember distance is positive, so let's fill in positive. So absolute value is positive. And let's look at one last example. It says, if the absolute value of x equals 7, circle the values that could represent x. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this number and put it into here. So the absolute value of 0 is 0, so I'm not going to choose that one. The absolute value of 7 is 7 because it's 7 places away from 0, so I would circle that one. The absolute value of negative 49 is positive 49, so cross that out. The absolute value of negative 7 is positive 7 because it's 7 spaces away from 0, so circle. And finally, the absolute value of 49 is positive 49, so let's eliminate that one. So remember, the absolute value of a number is always positive. And the only way that we could get an answer that would be negative is if you were to see a negative outside of the absolute value symbol. So let me show you an example. So the absolute value of 8, but if we saw a negative outside of it, that would actually be negative 8. You do not have to write this. I just wanted to review that. So that concludes my notes on absolute value. I hope you have a great day.